Canada took another hit today in U.S. President Donald Trump's trade war. Starting today, Canadian softwood lumber sent to the U.S. will face an additional 10% duty. Now, that's on top of a number of existing tariffs the industry faces, bringing the total duty up to 45%. And it doesn't stop there. Some furniture, such as kitchen cabinets and vanities, now face a 25% tariff as well. And that tariff is expected to double to 50% in January. New Brunswick Premier Susan Holt joins me now. Welcome to the program. The forestry industry is worth almost $1 billion in tax revenues for your province. What do the new tariffs mean for the industry and workers in New Brunswick?
The new tariffs mean a real challenge for our province's economy, for the people who work in the forestry sector. It's going to have a real negative impact on our economic output, on the activity of the sector, and on people's jobs.
Okay, so help me understand, though, because U.S. lumber demand exceeds its domestic supply. So American suppliers will, at least to some extent, still need to purchase from Canada to meet those demands. And they'll need, therefore, I'm presuming, to bite those extra tariff costs to some degree. So I guess we're trying to figure out how much of an impact do you expect to really see here and how much might be mitigated by the fact that we have something they need.
Yeah, though those are the questions that the economists are poring over right now, as well as the industry, to figure out how much do they have to take on themselves to remain in a somewhat competitive position to continue to sell their wood. How much does their customer have to take on in terms of that higher price? But from all of our analyses, this is going to hurt jobs, and it's going to hurt our economic growth. It's going to diminish growth in this province and across the country, because if people have to pay more, they're going to buy less.
And is that what you're hearing from the U.S. side, from buyers on this?
Yeah, they're telling us that they can't stomach higher prices. And so they're looking to see things like tariffs be cost shared across all of the players in the spectrum. So we can't pass on an entire 45% duty to the customer, because then they'll continue to seek alternatives. And the alternatives might not be available immediately, but they'll show up if they have to come up with a 45% difference. So the same way that we're looking for other customers, we need to be competitive in the sector. We need to make sure that we're not putting artificial costs like these duties and taxes that are going on the American people and the New Brunswickers. And for what? To make houses more expensive in the U.S. and to make it harder for everybody to build the homes that they need.
Well, in terms of responding, Premier Ford from Ontario has said Canada needs to fight back if we can't get a deal sorted. Is your government considering some sort of retaliation?
We're always looking at what levers we can pull and what buttons we can press that will improve our ability to sell our wood to the U.S. and really increase our chances of getting rid of these duties. The softwood lumber duties have long been a drag on both the American and the New Brunswick economy. And I say New Brunswick, but really we're talking about all of Canada, whether it's Quebec or BC or other provinces that are engaged in the forestry sector. So we are looking at the tools that we have at our disposal and which ones we think will be effective in bringing an end to these kind of tariffs.
And in terms of helping the workers and the industry, there is this promised aid package for the lumber industry that included $700 million in loan guarantees, $500 million for long-term supports. I guess we're wondering, has the industry received any of that funding? Is any of that money flowing since there's already been these duties in place and now we're just seeing an increase in those duties?
Yeah, well, today is the day that things go up from 35 to 45%, but we have been working with our industry here in New Brunswick all the way along to understand how these challenges are impacting them, figure out what tools the province has to support our forestry workers, and working with the federal government on their support, because we're going to need to bridge some of these businesses into either new markets or new products and some other things to replace the loss of the U.S. Business. And so there's
But is that money flowing?
right support package, I guess, the right support. Oh, well, look, we've had support packages in place since the first threat of the tariffs back in the earlier part of this year, and that included supports to our forestry businesses. And there's been some moves that we've made here to support them. And then been the federal programs. I'd have to check with my federal colleagues to see what drawdown there's been on those loan guarantees and on those aid packages. But everybody has remained hopeful that the team would get a deal. That's still our ultimate goal, is to work through this with the U.S., get to free, open, fair trade with the U.S., get a new deal in place that does not see these kind of duties on softwood lumber.
Now, Premier Eby out in British Columbia said that Minister Joly, who's the industry minister who has talked a lot about supports for workers, is really focused on the steel and auto sectors. And he says just doesn't get it yet when it comes to lumber. Do you see things in the same way? Do you agree with Premier Eby?
Well, I'm going to be speaking with Minister Joly tonight, and so it's another chance for me to emphasize to her the huge impact that the forestry sector has, both here in New Brunswick and across Canada, the impact on supply chains, on our housing crisis, and on our economy. And she'll hear the same messages that I regularly pepper Minister LeBlanc with, and the Prime Minister and the team that has been working on this, Minister Hodgson, of course, over at Natural Resources. So we will continue to emphasize with my colleagues, Premier Eby, Premier Legault, Premier Houston, who has a forestry sector, that these 43% tariffs, 45.19% tariffs, merit the kind of attention that is being given to the other tariffs that Canada's facing.
So that's what you'll say to her. What do you want to hear from her back today on this when you meet with her?
Well, an acknowledgement, the same things that we've thankfully been hearing from the Prime Minister and Minister LeBlanc, that they agree that the softwood lumber tariffs need to go, and that they have been raising them with the President of the United States last week, with Howard Lutnick last week, and again this week. They're pushing against the U.S. softwood lobby to get the table set to have those discussions, and that they will continue to make it a priority.
Thank you very much, New Brunswick Premier Susan Holt. Premier David Eby is warning that the British Columbia forest industry is in jeopardy after new U.S. tariffs on softwood lumber, timber, and furniture went into effect today.
This threat is a direct threat to the livelihood, to the existence of mills in every corner of British Columbia. And those mills provide jobs for families. They use the money they earn there to pay the rent, to pay the mortgage, and in some cases, to support entire communities. It's an existential threat that the sector is facing because of an attack by the President of the United States. It's going to drive up costs for Americans and make life more challenging for them as well.
These tariffs hit 1 week after the Prime Minister's meeting with the U.S. President, a meeting that has yet to show any movement on getting tariffs off Canadian goods. Here to talk about all that is the Power Panel. Emily Nicolas is a columnist for Le Devoir. Supriya Dwivedi was an advisor to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Lisa Raitt is a former Conservative cabinet minister. And Cheryl Oates was Director of Communications for former Alberta NDP Premier Rachel Notley. Welcome, all of you. I'll start with you, Lisa. Last week at the White House, President Trump said Canada would leave happy. But there's still no deal, and today we have these higher U.S. lumber tariffs kicked in. So where do you think the talks are?
So, there's even, I can understand why Premier Eby came out today and showed such concern, because it's not just that the Americans have started this new Section 232 tariff and that it's actually stacked on top of an already big tariff for softwood lumber. It's the fact that the term lumber, softwood seems to have fallen off the Canadian narrative of what's happening at the trade table. We're hearing both the Prime Minister and we're hearing Minister Joly single out steel, single out auto. But with respect to the lumber and wood industry, forest products industry, we're not hearing that. And I think that is a valid concern for both the workers and the businesses in this space. You have to keep this stuff front and center to make sure that it's actually part of the negotiations.
Cheryl, what do you make of this?
Yeah, I think David Eby looked very, very strong today. And whether it is perception or whether it's reality, it is often the case that Western Canada feels secondary to issues that are in closer proximity to Ottawa. And we've seen when auto sectors are targeted that Ottawa seems to mobilize overnight. And so David Eby was out there saying today, we would like you to also mobilize for this, an industry that has just as much at stake as aluminum and steel and auto, and is actually a bigger contributor to overall GDP. We would like the government to come to the table, not just to fight for relief for these tariffs, but also to help modernize the industry and protect the great jobs in British Columbia and in other areas of the country. So I think that he really hit the mark in both asking for the government to continue to push and, like Lisa said, elevate this to one of the key points of negotiation in Washington, but also to ask the government to make sort of a backup plan or a concession plan for if we don't get everything that we want, how will we make sure that we're protecting those jobs?
Supriya, does Donald Trump just have a different definition of what happy looks like? If we were supposed to leave happy and a week later we have additional tariffs?
Yeah, I mean, probably. Look, I'd wager to guess he has a different definition of a lot of words that we would use regularly that we'd all consider a little bit left field, right? I'd agree with my co-panelists here. I think Premier Eby came out really strong. And, as he pointed out earlier, the tariffs right now on Canadian softwood lumber are higher than the tariffs being slapped on Russia, which, of course, is absurd on its face. You've outlined the additional, 10% in addition to the 35% that was already in place, as well as this new 25% duty that's on some finished wood products. And you have these premiers that are very rightfully worried for their province and for their industries. And I think everyone here likely agrees that we need, trade diversification. But it's, of course, incredibly difficult to make up for a market like the U.S. because of the proximity and because of the amount of people that live in such a short window from us. And so what you don't want if you're the federal government is to have a bunch of premiers that are all, basically looking to knife one another to save their own provincial industries and all take it upon themselves to make their case directly to the U.S. Because, what we've had up until this point has been this sort of we're stronger together mentality. And I think that's what we should be, continuing in the face of this. And, it's especially true that we're stronger together when we're facing a bully like Trump. And I think it's important for us to remember that from time to time.
Emily?
I think there's a tricky situation here with two basically different concerns. The first one is, what do you bring to the agenda when you negotiate with Donald Trump? What is strategic to bring up first in order to make some wins and then gain also some trust in the relationship that allows you to go further on the files that are more contentious? So, for example, with that lens, I do understand why lumber, which has been an irritant for the Canadian-U.S. relationship long before Donald Trump was elected, to be the file you get to while you already have made some strides on the easier things to solve. On the other hand, there's the issue of what you prioritize nationally, how do you communicate internally, and how it can be very tempting for the Liberals right now to only insist on the things they can make wins on and trying to make us forget politically about the rest so that they look better internally, which has nothing to do with what is useful strategically to prioritize with Donald Trump. And I think what's happening this week with lumber and last week as well with the automobile sector, while it was said at the White House that it would prioritize steel and aluminum, is exactly that, is that there is basically not clear communication between what is the strategy at the White House and what is the strategy nationally. And I think that's what's creating a lot of frustrations with the premier. And if Ottawa was speaking more directly with the provinces and making sure that there was this open line of communication behind the scenes, you would not have the kind of political theater that we've been having in the last couple of days.
Supriya, speaking of clear communication, the Prime Minister has said they're working on modalities of an auto agreement. What do you think that means?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's not clear communication. I could surmise what that sort of means, that they're working on, kind of specific tidbits that they can hammer together to get towards something sembling of a deal. But this is part of the problem. The longer that this sort of drags on, the longer people don't see any sort of relief or any sort of movement on the trade file or on the tariff file here, you're going to get a bunch of folks that are looking to the federal government, rightfully so, to help clear that up. And if we don't, if we aren't speaking in clear, plain spoken language to people, if we aren't giving it to them straight, if we aren't, as Emily pointed out, giving the premiers a little bit of a heads up before these meetings, or giving them better tools themselves so that they can then deal with their own, constituencies and industries in their own provinces, then you do have a situation where all eyes end up on A.D. Wellington and figuring out, how the prime minister and his front bench are going to steer us through this.
Lisa, what are your thoughts on what modalities mean when it comes to some kind of agreement on autos?
I just feel, Karina, that they're trying to contain the damage to as little as possible and mitigate whatever damage there is going to be. I think we should all recognize the fact that things are not going to be the way they are today. We're not going to be as well off in the auto sector as we once were. There's no big room for improvement here is my takeaway. And it's based upon, quite frankly, what you're hearing Mr. Lutnick and Mr. Trump say, which is they don't understand why any automobiles should be assembled in Canada. They should be American jobs. So when you're starting from that point, what the prime minister and the team have to do is figure out, well, what can we salvage at this point in time, and what it is that we're going to do internally to mitigate against it. The communication point is well taken. And I think, the thing about lumber and wood products is they have a really great association. The Forest Products Association of Canada, it's run by Derek Nyber. They're very good at advocating for themselves, but they're just not getting any airtime right now. And I think people need to understand that it's 200,000 workers in small communities linked across this country that are going to be impacted, and they deserve to have a seat at a big table as well.
I will point out they've had some airtime today, certainly on our network, because I've certainly been watching those interviews. Cheryl, your thoughts on auto, lumber? Both have complained that they feel they're being left behind.
Well, I mean, in some cases, I think that is true, that industries like forestry haven't got the same level of attention that the auto sector has gotten over the last couple of months. That could be because the trade war over lumber has been going on for a long time, and some of the sectors that are most recently impacted, that's sort of a new story. But I do think that, having David Eby stand up and say, in the words that he chose today, that the industry is being ignored, and talking about the impacts that it has on GDP and on jobs, that's really important for the West, is to have, we could see it as political posturing. And certainly, I think domestically, this is very beneficial for David Eby to be able to stand up for his community like this. But it has the benefit of also being true. And the more that we have champions like that talking about the impacts of this on other jurisdictions outside of Ottawa or Ottawa area, I think the better off Canada is overall.
Emily, I wonder, in terms of what we've heard from Eby today on, hey, how is it possible that Russia can sell its wood, if it were to sell it, because I think we all know that it actually doesn't sell a lot of lumber to the U.S. And then we have autos. I mean, really, it comes down to the differences is that Canada is in competition with the U.S. The U.S. isn't competing with Russia on softwood lumber. So is that even something we can mitigate, when the facts of the matter is that we will always be in competition with the U.S. even if we have a free trade agreement?
The thing with lumber is that people will correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I understand lumber is that, and the Americans themselves are not, there's too many Americans for the needs of lumber. And so there's, even if you're going at it with very much an America first lens, you would still need Canadian lumber. And so the logic and what a lot of Canadian politicians have been pointing out is that by putting those tariffs on lumbers, you'll end up hurting American consumers who will end up needing Canadian lumber anyway and just pay a higher price for it. I think for the auto industry, I know that there's a lot of the jobs on the line right now, and so it might not be emotionally the right time to point this out, but at some point we do need to have the conversation on the fact that we have a huge Canadian auto industry, but there isn't, and I said it last week, but I will say it again, there isn't actually a Canadian car industry. You have American cars, you have Korean cars, you have Japanese cars, you have German cars, you have French cars, you even have Italian cars, but you don't have Canadian cars. And we've somehow built the economy of Southern Ontario on an economy in which there isn't any Canadian capital. We've been for decades basically trying to lure foreign industries into setting their factories into Canada. And this is a model in which, in terms of subsidies, gifts to companies, have already cost a lot of Canadian dollars. And at some point, we do need to have a conversation in terms of why was that strategically a really good thing. And part of it is the free trade agreement with the US and the fact that it might have been cheaper to set up industries in Canada for companies that are American. But it was always, I think, a point of vulnerability, for the Southern Ontario economy, and it's being exposed right now. But I think there needs to be some sort of a introspection in terms of, if we want to build a more sovereign Canadian economy, it means also making sure that there is some Canadian-owned component behind what drives a lot of the employment in this country.
Lisa, the Conservatives have been criticizing Carney for not making progress, but what can Canada do differently when dealing with the Trump administration? We keep hearing the word logic, but I think most people recognize that logic does not necessarily play a role in those arguments that you make when you're across the negotiating table. So what can Canada do differently that would actually get us across the finish line?
If only were that easy, Karina. But I would say this. I would say that I think sending mixed messages down to the United States, on one hand, the Prime Minister is becoming very close to Mr. Trump. They're making jokes with one another on hot mics, and they, Prime Minister is called out by the president. Where is he? Is he in the room? So that's one way of dealing with it. Making sure that you have a good relationship with the negotiator on the other side. But then you turn around and then you're watching other provinces, premiers, kind of rise to the occasion and take on the United States and criticize the Prime Minister. I mean, all that gets down to the United States on the same channels, and it can be very, I would say, confusing for the receiver. So I think I'm going to go back to what Emily said, which is they really do need to get a really good single point of view, single talking point when it comes to getting this deal done. And if it starts by having the Prime Minister sit down with all the provinces to lay out what his actual plan is at the moment, I think that's time well spent.
Cheryl, is part of the challenge for any government that the messaging nowadays is all public. I mean, there is obviously stuff going behind closed doors, but he's being judged on the comments and the things he says in the Oval Office, but also here domestically, there's a message for Canadians. I mean, we saw it with the whole elbows up, but not so much the elbows up. Is that part of the challenge for any Canadian government and Canadian leader?
Yeah, I think part of the challenge with this specific negotiation is that a lot of it can't be talked about publicly. Like, good negotiations don't happen in front of television cameras, and the stakes aren't talked about in front of television cameras, and the real threats are not made in front of television cameras. And that's the tough position that the government is currently in, is that they need to meet with the government of the United States. They need to have real negotiations. They need to make real progress. And at the same time, they need to be able to tell the Canadian public something about what's going on and something of an update. And that's really hard to do if you think that might upset the balance of your negotiation. And I think that's why you see some of these comments, like we're talking about the modalities of help for the auto sector, is because that's like an easy way to shelter in progress and make it sound like something's happening without giving anything away. And I think that is what the government has to do right now if they want to have, and hopefully they are having, a good faith negotiation with the United States.